One less confused worker ruining the vibe. Maybe now you'll remember where you belong.
The watch on his wrist was worth $19, and it was the most expensive thing he owned, because his mother had bought it with the last of a paycheck that had already been spent 3 times over in her head, and she had given it to him on a Tuesday in a hospital room that smelled of bleach and cheap carnations. Nathaniel Calloway wore it now under the cuff of a plain navy suit that had cost him $400 off a rack in a store that did not know his name. And he stood at the edge of the Sterling Grand Ballroom and let the light of 200 strangers pass over him without catching. He was 41 years old, and he owned more of the city than anyone in that room could imagine. Nobody looked at him twice. That was the point. He had learned a long time ago that the truly powerful did not need to announce themselves, and he had learned it the hard way standing at the service door of a ballroom, very much like this one when he was 14, watching a man in a tuxedo hand his mother an empty champagne flute and tell her to be quick about it. She had been quick about it. She had smiled the way the invisible learn to smile, the smile that asks for nothing and expects less, and Nathaniel had carried that smile in his chest for 27 years, like a stone worn smooth by a river. He had built an empire on the memory of that smile. He had come here tonight to see whether the men signing his money had ever learned what his mother knew. The chandeliers above him held 40,000 pieces of hand-cut crystal, and the caterers had been told to keep the champagne at exactly 11 degrees, and every screen along the far wall glowed with a single revolving logo, Halcyon Robotics, rendered in the cold silver blue that focus groups had decided meant the future. There was a string quartet in the corner playing something by Vivaldi that no one was listening to. There was a table of hors d'oeuvres that had cost more than the server carrying them would make in a month. There was, humming under all of it, the particular greed of a room that believes it is about to become richer. $1.15 billion. That was the number every mouth in the ballroom had tasted at least once that evening. The deal was the only thing anyone could talk about. And they talked about it the way people talk about whether they are certain will favor them, with the easy confidence of those who have never once been rained on. Halcyon Robotics was going to be saved tonight, or made, or crowned, depending on which cluster of tailored shoulders you drifted past. A mystery investor had come out of nowhere 11 weeks ago and offered to underwrite the entire expansion, and no one knew his name, and the not knowing had become its own kind of glamour. Nathaniel listened to a man in a $2,000 tuxedo explain to a woman in diamonds that the investor was almost certainly a sovereign wealth fund out of the Gulf, and he sipped his water, and he said nothing at all. He was the investor. Blackthorn Capital was his, whole and entire. Every share of it held quietly through 3 holding companies that led to a name no gossip columnist had ever bothered to chase. He had structured it that way, on purpose. He wanted to walk into the room that his money had built and find out who the people in it became when they thought no one important was watching. So far, the answer was not encouraging. Security had stopped him at the door before he had taken 4 steps inside. A guard with a coiled earpiece and a clipboard had looked at the navy suit and the plain shoes and the face that belonged to no magazine, and something in him had relaxed into contempt the way a fist relaxes when it decides it will not be needed. "You with the catering staff, sir," the guard had said, and it had not really been a question. Nathaniel had reached into his jacket and produced a matte black card with a small silver seal pressed into one corner, and the guard had gone the specific shade of red that men go when their instincts have just written a check their eyes cannot cash. He had stepped back. "Enjoy your evening, sir," he had said. The damage, small as it was already done, and Nathaniel had filed it away with all the rest. Inside, the same current followed him from room to room like a draft he could not close a door against. 2 women in sequined gowns pulled their clutches a half-inch closer when he passed, a movement so small and so practiced that he doubted they knew they had done it. A man at the bar in a white dinner jacket stepped in front of him without looking, ordered a Macallan neat, and then glanced back with the mild irritation of someone who has found a chair where he expected empty floor. "Staff line is over by the kitchen, friend," the man said. Nathaniel stepped aside and ordered water from the bartender and thanked her by the name on her tag, which was Nora, and she looked at him with a flicker of surprise because almost no one that night had looked at her at all. He found a place near a marble column at the edge of the room, close enough to see every face at the head table, far enough that no face would trouble itself to see him, and he settled in to watch and to wait and to remember why he had come. For a while he simply watched the room work, the way he had once watched his mother work, and the watching told him everything the glossy brochures never would. He watched a man in a silver tie send back a glass of Bordeaux, 'cause it was, he announced to the whole table, insultingly warm, and he watched the server take the blame for a bottle she had not chosen from a cellar she did not control, and he watched her apologize twice and dip her head without knowing she had dipped it. He watched a woman in a green gown let a cloth napkin fall to the floor and step over it and wait, without turning, for it to be replaced the way a person waits for an elevator. Small things. The kind of things that never make the news, because there is no crime in them that the law has ever bothered to name. The young woman from the bar, the one named Nora, moved through all of it with the particular economy of someone who cannot afford a single wasted step. He watched her carry a tray of 16 full flutes across a crowded floor without spilling one. Her eyes down, her shoulders square, and he knew the posture the way you know a song from its first two notes. It was his mother's posture. It was the posture of a person who has learned that being seen is more dangerous than being invisible, and who chooses, every single shift, to be invisible on purpose. Once, near the ice sculpture, he saw Camille Whitlock stop the girl with a raised finger and send back a whole tray of canapes because the salmon, she said, loudly enough for her circle to enjoy it, had clearly been cut by someone who did not care. The girl said she was sorry. She said it the way you say a word you have said 10,000 times, worn smooth of all its meaning. A coin passed through too many hands. Camille had already turned back to her friends before the apology was finished, because the apology had never been the point. The audience was the point. The audience was always the point. And he understood then, with the cold clarity that had made him rich, that the woman in the gold gown did not save her contempt for the powerless because she was careless. She saved it for the powerless because they were the only people with whom it felt safe to be honest. When the green-gowned woman's napkin had lain on the marble for a full minute ignored, Nathaniel crossed the small distance and picked it up and set it on the edge of the table, and the woman thanked the air near him without once looking at his face, having already filed him as the person whose job that was. He did not mind. He had not done it for her. He had done it because his mother had come home and cried, exactly once in 31 years over a napkin, and he had been 9 years old, and he had never in his life forgotten the sound. The woman he had come to understand appeared at 7:43. Camille Whitlock came onto the small stage, the way a tide comes into a harbor, slow and certain and impossible to argue with, in a gold gown that caught every filament of light in the room and threw it back doubled. She lifted one hand and waved, and the wave was not a greeting but a benediction, the gesture of a woman who had decided long ago that the affection of strangers was a tax the world owed her and paid gladly. Beside her stood her husband. Preston Whitlock was 52 and looked 45, and had spent a great deal of money to arrange the difference, and his tuxedo had been cut so close to the body that it seemed less like clothing than like an argument he was winning. He was the face of halcyon robotics. He smiled at the cameras with the confidence of a man who had never once been told the word no and meant. Everyone in the room watched them. Everyone except the one man who owned the company they were about to sign their futures to. Nathaniel watched them too, but he watched them differently, the way a doctor watches a patient who does not yet know the results are back. He saw the way Preston's eyes swept the room and priced it. He saw the way Camille's smile switched on and off with the cameras, warm when the lens found her, flat and searching when it moved away. He saw in the two of them together the particular hunger of people who have gotten everything and are terrified every waking hour that someone will notice they did not earn it. He knew that hunger. He had spent his life around it. He had learned to smell it, the way his mother had learned to smell rain. The host tapped the microphone, and the feedback silenced the quartet. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "welcome to the Halcyon Dynamics Gala, and welcome to the future." The applause came up out of the crowd like a reflex that had been rehearsed, and it had been, in a sense, because every person clapping had practiced this exact enthusiasm at 100 rooms before this one. "Tonight we celebrate a partnership that will reshape this city," the host went on. $1.15 billion of shared vision, and a new era for everyone lucky enough to be standing in this room. The greed in the air thickened until Nathaniel could almost taste it on the back of his tongue, warm and metallic, like a coin held too long in a closed hand. It was Camille who found him. Her gaze had been traveling the room the way a searchlight travels a fence line, and it snagged on him, on the plain navy suit and the water glass and the stillness, and her smile changed. It curled at one corner into something private and pleased, the look of a hunter who has spotted the one animal in the field that has not yet learned to run. She leaned toward her husband and said something behind 3 fingers, and Preston's eyes followed hers and landed on Nathaniel, and his eyebrows came down, and he stepped off the stage. He crossed the floor with the tight, fake warmth of a man who has decided that a problem can be solved by charm, applied firmly enough. He stopped a foot too close and tapped the shoulder of the navy suit. Tapped it twice, the way a man taps a vending machine that has taken his money. "Sir," Preston said, "are you sure you are supposed to be standing here?" Nathaniel kept his voice low and even. "I am fine here," he said. "I am just watching." "Watching," Preston repeated, and he let the word hang there so the people nearby could enjoy it with him. He turned his head and snapped his fingers at a passing server. Snapped them the way you would at a dog that had wandered from its yard. "Get this gentleman a towel," he said. "He looks like he is sweating clean through that budget suit of his." A ripple of laughter moved through the little crowd that had gathered without seeming to gather. The way crowds do around cruelty, drawn and ashamed and unwilling to leave. Someone near the bar said, not quietly enough, that the staff entrance was on the other side, and someone else laughed into a champagne flute. Camille arrived then, unhurried, her heels striking the marble in a clean and confident rhythm. She lifted a glass of red wine from a passing tray without looking at the girl who carried it. Without a word, without a glance, as though the tray had been floated to her by the air itself. She looked Nathaniel over slowly, from the plain shoes to the $400 suit to the face that no one in the room had thought to recognize, and she smiled the smile that had gotten her everything she had. "Sweetheart," she said, "if you needed the extra shift tonight, you could have simply signed up with the agency." Pretending to be a guest is not a good look on anyone. Nathaniel said nothing. His silence did something to her that words never could have. It sat there between them, patient and unbothered, and she felt the eyes of the room on her and understood that she had started something she now had to finish. She pushed the wine glass toward his chest. "Table 3 needs their pour," she said. "Go on. They are waiting on you." He did not lift a hand to take it. Her smile thinned at the edges and the warmth drained out of it like water out of a cracked basin. "Seriously," she said, her voice climbing. "Do your job," and Preston, who could not bear to let his wife hold the room a moment longer than he did, reached over and took the glass from her hand. "Allow me," he said. He raised the glass high, higher than he needed to, and let his eyes travel the crowd the way a performer checks the seats before the last line of the act. "One less confused worker ruining the vibe," he said. And he tipped the glass forward and poured the wine straight down the front of Nathaniel Calloway's chest. The wine came warm through the fabric before it came cold. It ran down under his collar in dark and narrowing lines. It soaked into the plain navy jacket and the white shirt beneath it. It dripped from the hem and onto the marble in small red stars. A gasp broke across the nearest tables and rolled outward. Somebody said, low and delighted and horrified, that he had actually done it. Phones came up all over the room, held at the height of the eyes. Glass eyes recording glass eyes, and Camille laughed under her breath, a small satisfied sound, and said that maybe now he understood where he stood. Nathaniel Calloway stood very still. He felt the wine reach his belt. He felt 200 pairs of eyes on him, and under them, older and heavier, He felt the eyes of a 14-year-old boy at a service door watching a man hand his mother an empty glass. He let himself feel it all the way down, the way you let a wave pass over you instead of fighting it. And then he lifted 2 fingers and wiped his jaw slowly once, and looked at the red on his fingertips as though it were a fact he had suspected for a long time, and had now finally confirmed. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise his eyes. He straightened his ruined jacket with both hands, the way a man squares himself before stepping out into cold weather. And he turned, and he walked toward the exit, and he did not say one single word. Behind him, a server whispered to another that the man had just walked out like he owned the whole place. Nobody believed her. Not yet. The hallway outside was cool and nearly silent, and the noise of the ballroom fell away behind the heavy doors, until it was only a muffled pressure like a party heard through the wall of a neighboring room. Nathaniel walked steadily down the corridor, his fingertips brushing the wine that was already going tacky across his chest, and he breathed in once, slow, and let it out, and pulled his phone from the inside pocket that the wine had not reached. The screen lit his face pale in the dim hall. He pressed a single name. The line picked up before the first ring finished. "Ready for your instructions, sir," the voice said. Nathaniel's voice stayed low and flat and entirely without heat. "Pull the offer," he said. "Freeze every channel tied to Halcyon. Send the termination notice now, tonight, and copy the board." "Understood," the voice said. There was no argument in it. There never was. The call ended. He stood a moment in the empty corridor. There was no anger in his face, and there was no triumph either, only the tiredness of a man who has hoped for something small and specific and has once again been told no. A couple by the elevator watched him with the half-formed recognition of people who cannot place a face they are certain they should know. "That is the one they poured the wine on," the woman murmured. Her husband shook his head slowly and watched Nathaniel walk. "The quiet ones," he said. "Rich folks never do expect the quiet ones to bite back." The elevator came and he stepped into it, and the doors closed on his reflection, on the steady eyes and the calm jaw and the dark stain spreading across a cheap and ruined suit. His phone buzzed against his palm. "Legal has the notice," the message read. "Wires are already reversing." He put the phone away. He watched the numbers count down. When the doors opened onto the lobby, the whole bright space was loud with guests who had drifted out to take calls and trade gossip, and a few of them turned as he crossed the marble, and a few of them saw the stain, and a low murmur followed him toward the revolving doors. "That is him," a man at the lobby bar said quietly to no one. "You do not walk like that unless you are somebody." Nathaniel did not slow down. Outside, the night air off the bay came cold and clean and sharpened everything to a point. A valet in a red vest hurried toward him with the ticket already half out of the little numbered box, and Nathaniel raised one hand gently and told him that walking was fine, and the young man stepped back, unsure of what he had just been part of. Behind him, faint and then not faint at all, the music inside the Sterling Grand Ballroom swelled up toward a crescendo, and then it cut dead. Inside, everything came apart at once. The quartet stopped mid-phrase, the bows lifting off the strings in ragged unison, and the great screens along the wall flickered and stuttered and lost the revolving silver logo for a heartbeat before it returned. The host stood frozen at the microphone with her smile still half assembled on her face. A tall man in a gray suit came fast through the tables, with a phone pressed to his ear, weaving between the chairs, his face traveling in the space of 10 steps from confusion to something close to terror. He reached the stage and leaned up and said 3 words into the host's ear, and Nathaniel, had he still been there, could have read them from across the room. The host went white to the lips. Preston noticed first, because men like Preston are always watching the room for the exact moment the attention leaves them. "What is going on?" he said. The host swallowed and could not seem to find the shape of the words. "The signing," she said finally. "The signing has been suspended." The room came apart into 100 overlapping voices. "Suspended for what?" a woman near the front said. "You do not freeze a $1.15 billion deal in the middle of a gala." Camille came off the stage with her gold gown hissing against the steps and gripped the host by the arm, hard enough to leave a mark. "Who gave that order?" she said. The host looked as though she would rather have been anywhere on earth. "It came from the top," she said. "The directive is final." Preston's jaw locked and something ugly flickered under the practiced calm. "I am the top," he said. And the host, to her lasting credit, shook her head and said, "Not tonight, sir." Across the ballroom, the executives had begun to stare into their phones the way men stare into water that is rising faster than they can climb. Alerts stacked one atop another, each worse than the last. Every account tied to Halcyon is frozen. One man said out loud, "To no one, to everyone." Another voice cracked across him. "The institutional partners are pulling out. My whole screen has gone red." A woman in emeralds sat down slowly in a chair that a waiter had to catch and steady behind her. "The stock," someone kept saying. "Look at the stock. Look at the after hours. That cannot be real. That number cannot be real." And then, near the doors, a young man in a rented tuxedo touched his friend on the shoulder and turned his phone around. "Look at this," he said. His friend leaned in and his eyes went wide and slow. "Wait," he said, "is that not the guy they poured the wine on?" The clip had already left the building. It had left the building before Nathaniel reached the sidewalk, uploaded by 3 different phones from 3 different angles, and it was climbing now through the feeds of the city, like fire climbing dry grass in a hot wind. It showed Preston raising the glass. It showed the wine going down the front of the plain navy suit in a clean dark sheet. It showed Camille smirking beside him with her chin lifted. And it showed the man in the ruined suit wiping his jaw and turning and walking out without a word. And under it someone had already written the caption that the whole country would read by morning. They humiliated a man they thought was staff. He walked out and canceled their billion-dollar deal. The clip moved through the ballroom itself now, phone to phone, and the silence that followed it was a different kind of silence than the greed had been. Guests looked at their screens, and then they looked at Preston and Camille, standing marooned in the middle of the marble floor, and then they looked back at their screens, and the arithmetic they were doing was visible on every face. Camille grabbed her husband's arm. "Fix it," she said, her voice low and fast and shaking. "Fix it right now." "I do not even know what broke," he snapped. "Somebody did this on purpose," she said. "Somebody in this room did this to us on purpose." A new alert bloomed across the great screens behind the stage, silver blue turning to hard white, the letters tall enough to read from the farthest table. Halcyon Robotics partnership terminated, effective immediately. No warning, no renegotiation, no appeal. Just gone, the way a light is gone when a hand finds the switch. A board member crossed the floor toward Preston with a face the color of ash. "This is a catastrophe," he said, his voice trembling with a fury that had not yet found its footing. "Do you have any idea at all, who you offended in this room tonight?" "I offended no one," Preston barked. "You offended the man who was funding the entire deal," the board member said. Camille's breath caught in her throat. "Who?" she whispered. The board member lowered his voice, as though saying the name too loudly might make the ruin more permanent than it already was. "Nathaniel Calloway," he said. "He owns Blackthorn Capital. He owns the investor. He owns all of it, every share. And you poured a glass of wine down his shirt in front of 200 people and 1,000 cameras." The color went out of Preston Whitlock's face the way water goes out of a tub when the plug is pulled, all at once and from the bottom. Near the wall a server whispered to another that she had told them. She had told them he did not walk like staff. The second server whispered back that they had picked the wrong man tonight, and that they had picked him very badly. Guests began backing toward the doors. Some slipped out in silence, coats over their arms, already composing the version of the night they would tell. Others kept filming, phones held high like torches at the edge of something burning, and the future of Halcyon Robotics cracked open in real time under 40,000 pieces of hand-cut crystal. And somewhere out past the valet stand, past the streetlights, past the long black cars idling at the curb, Nathaniel Calloway kept walking, unhurried and unbothered, already 3 moves ahead of every person still standing frozen on that marble floor. He walked 11 blocks before he called for his car, because he wanted the cold, and he wanted the quiet, and because the stain on his shirt had begun to dry and pull at his skin, and he found he did not want to be rid of it yet. It reminded him of something he did not want to forget. When the car finally came, it was not a supercar, and it was not a limousine. It was a 9-year-old sedan driven by a man named Ellis who had worked for him since before there was money. And Nathaniel got in the back and looked out at the city that his money moved through like blood, through a body that did not know his name. And he thought about his mother. Her name had been Grace Calloway, and she had cleaned banquet halls for 31 years. And she had died at 58 of a cancer that a wealthier woman would have caught a year sooner. She had never once raised her voice to the people who treated her as furniture. She had told him near the end in the bleach and carnation room with the $19 watch still in its little box on the tray table that a person who is cruel to someone who can do nothing for them has shown you exactly who they are, and that he should believe them the first time. He had believed them. He had built Blackthorn on believing them. And tonight 2 people who had everything had looked at a man who could do nothing for them, as far as they knew, and they had shown him exactly who they were. He let his head rest against the cold window and let the years run backward the way they do when a man is tired and has just been reminded of who he is. He had started with nothing, which is a sentence rich men love to say, and almost none of them have earned, and he had earned it down to the letter. At 16, he had boozed tables at a chop house off Geary for $2 over minimum, and he had swept the same 40 feet of tile every night at closing. And he had learned the first real lesson of money by watching. Who left a tip on a $9 breakfast, and who stiffed a $100 dinner. And it was never the people you would guess. At 19, he had talked his way into the mailroom of a brokerage downtown. At 23, he had made his first real trade with $4,000. He could not afford to lose. On a company, everyone clever was selling, because he had noticed something true about it, that the clever money had grown too comfortable to see. That was the whole of his gift, if it was a gift, he noticed. He had spent a childhood being invisible, and invisibility, it turned out, was only another word for the freedom to watch. Blackthorn came at 31, the same age his mother had been when she took the banquet hall job, and he had noticed that too, and had said nothing about it to anyone. He built it slowly, and he built it quiet. He could have had the glass tower with his name across the top. The corner office 40 floors up the parade of magazine covers his peers chased like dogs chasing cars. They would not know how to drive if they ever caught one. He could have flown private everywhere he went, and once, for 2 years, he had, before he noticed that the private jet did to him precisely what the ballroom did to the Whitlocks. That it built a wall of glass between a man and the world, and then told him the wall was a reward. He sold the plane. He flew first class when he had to, and coach when he could stand it. And he kept the 9-year-old sedan and the man named Ellis. And he kept the oatmeal-colored house. And every spring his accountants suggested a penthouse, and every spring he declined. The money, when it finally came, and it came in an amount that would have frightened his mother, never once felt like his. It felt like something he was holding for someone else. He had never been able to name who. Until tonight in the back of that sedan, with the wine drying stiff on his chest, when he understood that he had been holding it all these years for the girl carrying 16 flutes across a marble floor with her eyes down and her shoulders square. For every version of his mother, in every bright room in the country, who had been taught that the safest thing she could do with herself was disappear. He was not going to hand them speeches. Speeches were the thing the Whitlocks of the world did. He was going to hand them the one thing his mother had never once received in 31 years of work, and he was going to pay it in the only currency that had ever truly mattered, which was to be seen. He had one more thing to do before he let the night close. He took out his phone, and he did not call his lawyer, and he did not call his board. He called the events director of the Sterling Grand, a woman he had quietly retained through a subsidiary 2 years earlier, and he asked her one question. He asked for the name of the young server working the West Floor bar, the one with the dark hair and the tired eyes, the one who had said "You are welcome" as though she meant it. Her name is Nora Bell, the director told him. 26, works doubles 4 nights a week. Nathaniel thanked her and ended the call and sat with the name a while. The way you sit with a name you intend to keep. He knew already, because he made it his business to know, the kind of arithmetic that lived behind eyes like Nora Bell's. He would learn the rest within the week, and it would be worse than he guessed, and more ordinary than anyone rich would believe. Nora Bell had a 4-year-old son named Theo, who had been born with a hole between the 2 upper chambers of his heart, and the surgery that would close it had been approved and scheduled and approved again and delayed, and the portion the insurance would not carry came to $14,600, and she had $1,100 of it saved in a coffee can behind the flour. She worked the doubles for the tips. She had smiled at the man in the ruined suit and called him sir and meant it, because she knew, the way the invisible always know each other across a crowded room, that he was one of hers. But that was for later. That was for the part of the story that no camera would ever record. Because kindness makes poor footage, and the world that had made the wine clip go to 9 million views in a single night would never once click on the quiet thing that came after. The loud part came first. Morning hit Preston and Camille Whitlock like a truck that had never learned where the brakes were. The headlines had crossed the country before the sun cleared the East Bay Hills. The wine clip looped on every screen in America, Preston's arm tipping forward, Camille's chin lifting, the silent man wiping his jaw, the caption burning underneath. The comments came down on the 2 of them without mercy or nuance or end. Investors bailed one after another, their emails short and their signatures cold. Longtime partners went dark. 2 board members resigned before 9 in the morning and a 3rd by noon, and the stock of Halcyon Robotics fell so far and so fast that the numbers on the screen looked less like finance than like weather, like the readout of a thing falling out of the sky. The world, which loves a fall the way it loves a fire, could not get enough of it. By the 2nd day, the clip had been watched 31 million times, and it had grown in the retelling into something close to a parable. Strangers who had never met Nathaniel Calloway wrote long and certain paragraphs about his character. Morning shows played the 14 seconds of wine on a loop between the weather and the traffic. A cable host called him the most powerful man in America that nobody could pick out of a lineup, and said it with open admiration, as though invisibility were a clever strategy he had chosen rather than a wound he had learned to carry. 3 separate reporters found the oatmeal-colored house within a week. He did not answer the door. He stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand and watched them through the gap in the curtain. And he felt, watching them, the strangest and loneliest thing, which was that they had made him into the exact sort of person he had spent his whole life refusing to become. A name, a logo, a man whose worth the room agreed upon before he had even entered it. He understood the danger of it plainly, the way he understood everything plainly except the things about himself. The same crowd that had lifted their phones to film a man being humiliated had now lifted their phones to celebrate him. And it was the same motion exactly, the same hunger merely pointed in a flattering direction. They had not learned the lesson. They had simply found a new man to point at. If the wind turned tomorrow, they would film his fall with the identical delight they had brought to the Whitlocks. And the thought did not make him bitter. It made him tired, because it meant the work was never finished. He turned off the television. He did not read the paragraphs strangers wrote about his character, kind or cruel, because he had learned long ago that a man who believes the room when it loves him has already agreed to believe it when it turns. He poured the cold coffee down the drain and made a fresh cup and sat at the same kitchen table he had eaten at for 11 years. And he took a plain sheet of paper and a pen, and he began, in his own careful hand, to write down names. Not the Whitlocks. He had already forgotten the Whitlocks, the way a man forgets a bill the moment it is paid. The list was of servers, bartenders, coat-check girls, the people who had been carrying trays across that ballroom while 200 guests decided among themselves who counted and who did not. He was going to find every last one of them. It was going to take him the better part of a year. It was the only part of the entire affair that he intended to enjoy. Camille did not sleep. She sat on the edge of a bed that had cost as much as a small car, and held a phone that would not stop buzzing, and she watched the number of people who despised her climb past any number she could hold in her mind, and her mascara ran in gray lines she did not bother to fix. Preston paced the length of the penthouse with his shirt untucked and his hair wild, making calls that ended the same way every time, the way a door ends a hallway. "We are out," the voices said. "Do not call this number again." By 10 in the morning, the private bank that had carried their line of credit for 9 years froze it pending review. By noon, the brokerage that managed the trust called to say that 3 of the covenants had tripped at once, and that the supercar in the garage and the second home in Aspen and the penthouse itself were all, in the careful language of ruin, now under discussion. It was Camille who said it first, at 12:30, standing at the great window with the whole bright, indifferent city spread out below her. "We have to go to him," she said. "If we do not go to him and make this right, everything is gone." Preston stood in the middle of the room with his hands open at his sides like a man who has dropped something he cannot find. He did not argue. He had run out of the particular energy that arguing requires. He nodded once, weak and defeated and entirely out of moves, and he went to find a jacket that did not smell of the worst night of his life. They drove across the city to a neighborhood that surprised them. And the surprise itself told the whole story of how little they had understood. They had expected a fortress. They had expected gates and cameras, and a house that announced a fortune the way their own did, loudly and without pause. What they found instead was a quiet street of ordinary houses with ordinary lawns, a mail carrier walking an unhurried route, a boy on a bicycle, a plain 2-story house, the color of oatmeal, with a single old sedan in the drive, and a porch with 2 wooden chairs on it that had clearly been sat in. They checked the address 3 times. They could not make it fit the man who had erased them with a phone call, and that was because they had never once in their lives understood what real power looked like when it had nothing left to prove. Nathaniel opened the door himself. He wore a gray sweater, and he held a cup of coffee, and he looked at the 2 of them standing on his porch, the way a man looks at weather he has been expecting, without surprise and without much interest. Behind him the house was warm and lived in and quiet. He did not ask them in. Camille spoke first, and her voice broke clean in half before she reached the end of the sentence. "We were wrong," she said. "We treated you like you were nothing. Please let us fix this." Preston's voice came next, and it shook in a way that his voice had never once been allowed to shake in a boardroom. "We have lost everything," he said. "Everything. Just give us a chance to sit down and talk. Just a conversation. That is all we are asking for." Nathaniel stepped back from the doorway, but he did not open the door wider, and the difference between those 2 movements was the whole of what he had come to teach them. He kept his voice low, and it was not cruel, and that was somehow worse than cruelty would have been. "You did not lose everything last night," he said. "You lost it the moment you decided that a person is worth only as much as he can do for you. You have been losing it for years. Last night you simply got the invoice." They stood there, and for the first time in either of their lives they were small. In a way they had no tools to manage, no charm to spend, no name to drop, no waiter to summon. Camille wiped her face with the back of her hand, and the last of the mascara came away, and left her looking younger, and more frightened and more human than she had looked in 20 years. "We did not know who you were," she whispered. "That is the problem," Nathaniel said. "It was not who I was." He set the coffee cup down on the porch rail and looked at both of them, and his voice did not rise. "You did not care who I was. That is the whole of it. If I had been what you thought I was, a tired man in a cheap suit who had wandered into the wrong room, everything you did to me still would have been true about you. The wine would have been the same. The laughter would have been the same. The only thing that has changed is the size of the bill, and you are standing on my porch, upset about the size of the bill, not about the thing you did to earn it." Preston swallowed, and his throat worked, and something in him, some last executive reflex, tried one final time to find the lever that would move this man. "Is there anything?" he said. "Anything at all we can do." Nathaniel shook his head once, slowly, and there was no pleasure in it, which was the thing they would remember longest. "The deal is gone," he said. "The trust is gone, and my door is closed. He picked the coffee back up. He looked past them at the ordinary street, at the boy on the bicycle making a slow loop at the end of the block. "Walk carefully from here," he said. "The world is a great deal smaller than the two of you were ever taught to believe." He stepped back into the warm and quiet house and closed the door. Not hard, not for effect. Just closed it, the way you close a door on a draft. And Preston and Camille Whitlock stood on the porch of a stranger who owned their future for a long moment in the cold, clear light. And then they walked back down the path to the car. And the porch behind them stayed exactly as it had been, and it never once thought of them again. What followed the two of them was slower than the wine clip, and far more thorough. The federal complaint came 11 days later, not from Nathaniel, who never lifted a finger toward it, but from a securities regulator who had watched the after-hours collapse and pulled a thread and found, as regulators sometimes do, that the whole garment had been coming apart for years. Preston Whitlock had been moving numbers between subsidiaries, the way a man moves a pea under 3 shells. And the deal that was meant to save Halcyon had also been meant to bury 2 years of it, and now there was no deal, and there was only the buried thing, uncovered, in the daylight, in front of everyone. The company filed for protection in the spring. The penthouse sold in the summer to a buyer who gutted it. Camille filed the paperwork that ends a marriage in the fall. On a gray Tuesday, alone, in an office with fluorescent lights and a water cooler that hummed, and she signed her maiden name for the first time in 22 years and did not recognize her own hand. And here is the thing the cameras never came back for, because there was no cruelty in it, and therefore no reason for the world to look. Late in the winter, in a courtroom on the 3rd floor of a building downtown, on the morning that the last of the sentencing was read, a woman who had once worn a gold gown that caught every light in a ballroom sat in a hard wooden pew in a coat she had bought secondhand. And she understood, finally, all the way down, the thing that Nathaniel Calloway had said on his porch. It was not the deal. It had never been the deal. She had spent her whole life being cruel to people who could do nothing for her, and she had called it standards, and she had called it taste, and she had called it knowing her own worth. And it had been none of those things. It had been the one thing, the only thing, and she had not seen it until it cost her everything, which is the only way that people like her ever come to see it at all. Nathaniel Calloway did not watch any of it. He had learned from his mother that vengeance is a meal that never fills you, and that the only thing worth doing with power is the thing that no one will ever film. So while the city chewed through the ruin of the Whitlocks, he did the quiet thing. The thing this story was really about all along. The thing that began the night a young server called him Sir and meant it. He did not send Nora Bell money. He knew what money sent from above does to a person who has learned to be proud in poverty, how it can land like an insult even when it is meant as a gift. And he had spent too many years watching his mother refuse charity that came with a raised eyebrow to make that mistake now. Instead, he did what a man does when he has understood something. He had Blackthorne quietly acquire the hospitality group that staffed the Sterling Grand, and within a month the health plan for every hourly worker in it had changed. Not with an announcement, not with a press release, just a new card in the mail and a number to call. And the $14,600 that stood between a 4-year-old named Theo and the operation that would close the hole in his heart simply, on a Wednesday, ceased to exist. Nora Bell never knew who had done it. She stood in the corridor of the Children's Hospital at 6 in the morning on the day of the surgery, in the flat gray light before the sun found the windows, and she pressed her forehead to the cool glass of the waiting room, and she cried the way you cry when a weight you have carried so long that you forgot. It was a weight is finally, without warning, lifted. She thought it was luck. She thought it was God. She thought it was the slow, grinding mercy of a system that had for once worked. She never once thought it was the man in the ruined Navy suit, because the world had taught her, the way it teaches all of the invisible, that men like that do not remember men like her. But he remembered. He remembered because a woman named Grace Calloway had smiled at a man who handed her an empty glass, and had carried an empty tray back across a marble floor with her head level and her back straight. and had come home to a small apartment and put a $19 watch on layaway for a son she believed would be somebody one day. Not because he would be rich, she had told him, but because he would remember. That was the whole of the inheritance she left him. Not the money, which came later and came fast and never once felt like hers. Just the instruction. Remember what it feels like to be treated as nothing, and then spend your whole life making sure the people around you never have to feel it. Halcyon Robotics was bought out of protection 18 months later by a firm no one had heard of, restructured and quietly made whole, and the 412 people who had been about to lose their jobs kept them. And their new health plan was, coincidentally, very good. The firm that bought it was a subsidiary of a company held through 3 others, at the end of which, if anyone had cared to look, and no one did, was a plain 2-story house the color of oatmeal, and a man in a gray sweater, and 2 wooden chairs on a porch that had been sat in. The boy came through the surgery in 4 hours and 11 minutes. The hole in Theo Bell's heart, the one that had cost his mother $1,100 saved dollars and 1,000 sleepless nights, was closed by a surgeon who would never learn that the bill for it had quietly ceased to exist, and the boy woke in the recovery room asking for apple juice, and he got it. And within a year he was running full speed down a hallway. His mother had once been afraid he would never be strong enough to walk. Nora kept the coffee can. She did not need it anymore, but she kept it behind the flower with the $1,100 still folded inside, because there are lessons a person does not set down simply because the weather has cleared. When the hospitality group that staffed the Sterling Grand announced, that spring, a fund that would cover the medical costs of any hourly worker and their children, no matter the amount, no questions asked, Nora read the email twice and then a third time, and she cried at the break room table, and she never once connected it to the quiet man she had handed a glass of water on the worst night of 2 very rich people's lives. A year after that, they made her a floor manager, and then, because she was good at it, in the way that only people who have carried the trays are ever good at it, they made her more. She learned every name on her staff. She learned their children's names. She learned who was 1 bad week away from the kind of hole that a coffee can behind the flower can never fill, and she found quietly, without an audience, ways to fill it first. She had no idea she was passing down an inheritance. She only knew that a stranger had once looked at her, really looked, on a night when no one else in a room of 200 had, and that it had cost him nothing, and had changed the shape of her whole life, and that she intended to spend the rest of hers doing the same arithmetic for someone else. Nathaniel Calloway went to very few galas after that, and when he did, he went the same way he had always gone, in a plain suit with a $19 watch under his cuff. And he tipped the coat check and learned the bartenders' names and thanked the young woman refilling the water without being asked. Sometimes a man in an expensive tuxedo would glance at him and price him and look away, and Nathaniel would feel the old stone turn over once in his chest and then go still. He had stopped needing them to know who he was. That was the freedom his mother had been trying to hand him along with the watch, and it had taken him 41 years and a glass of wine down the front of a cheap suit to finally take it. Because here is the thing that the powerful spend fortunes trying not to learn, and that a woman who cleaned banquet halls for 31 years knew for free. You can measure the exact worth of a person by how they treat someone who can do nothing for them. Not the client, not the investor, not the man who can sign the check or open the door or change the life. The waiter, the cleaner, the tired stranger in the plain suit at the edge of the room. What you do to them when you believe it is free is the truest sentence you will ever speak about yourself. And the world is smaller than you think, and the bill always, always comes. They poured wine on a man they thought was no one, in front of 200 people, because they had decided long ago that some people simply do not count. They were wrong about him, but that was never the point, and it was never the lesson. And if you take only one thing from the whole of this long, strange night, let it be the thing he never said out loud on that porch. The thing his mother handed him in a room that smelled of bleach and carnations. The thing that was true of the man in the ruined suit, and true of the server who called him sir, and true of every single person who has ever been made to feel like furniture in a room full of light. Dignity is not a privilege, it is a basic right.